Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello. As you know, with me, it's all about the pursuit of joy. And I have a lot of joy here in my Australian bar. And I just thought I'd show you that when I set aside perfection and embrace playfulness, I like to arrange things, little treats for my friends, and a lovely rainbow. Do you see that? A rainbow of beautiful treats. And I like to sprinkle something on top just to give it a little bit of artisanal charm. Maybe some peanuts or maybe some, I don't know, maybe cashews or, Pringles are good. And that really sets the scene. I think to entertain, I love to entertain. Anyway, welcome to the Australian bar. And to me, it's not Meghan. It's Phil Craig in a wig. Had you guessed? I bet you've been fooled, hadn't you? Anyway, I'm going to rearrange myself. And in a minute, I might say something half intelligent about Meghan and various other things. So welcome to the Scandal Mongers podcast. To be Phil Craig, the Australian bar. Here we are again. Good week last week. Very good week. Thank you so much for all of you who watched the programme. Best for quite some time. Yeah, it's seduction. Who knew people found that more interesting than death? But lots to talk about today. Lots of things happening in the world, in my world, in your world, in the White House, all over the place, on Netflix with Meghan. Where to begin? Well, as usual with the comments. Lots of lovely things actually this week. So many of you have been in touch. It's been a great week for comments. A lovely Twitter. Actually, no, this was Blue Sky. Yes, I have a small presence on Blue Sky now. Becky Azen. I've been in touch with you, Becky, for years, and I didn't even know you listened to the podcast. And you wrote this lovely thing. Thanks, Phil, for carving out a calm and lovely corner of the WWW Wild West Web. Just what the therapist ordered. That is a gorgeous comment, Becky. Thank you so much. And you know what? For that comment, you're going to get the comment of the month. Yes, you are. And I'm going to send you a mug if you're listening. If not, I know where to find you. Are you in Australia or in England? I'm not even sure. But wherever you are, I'm going to send you a mug and you can have your choice of slogan. Another day, another scandal's popular, as is naughty girl. Anyway, you can decide whether you're a naughty girl or not. Other comments have been pouring in, which I've really enjoyed reading. Lynn Re-Enterprises. I'm sure you've commented before. I love your platform, Phil, and I've enjoyed every episode from the beginning. All the best, Linda, now from Centurion Gotang, no longer Kimberley, North Cape, South Africa. It's great to say hello to our South African friends. Hello. AM7669, love your podcast, but spending the first few minutes talking about yourself is rather repetitive and self-centered. Oops. Oh, God, I did it again. But the core content and your professional approach are great, and I really enjoy them and want to listen to many more. And I subscribed on day one. Well, thank you for that. Merci et bonne journée from France. That's great. I don't think we've had a French person commenting. We've had some Belgians. Very nice to have you on board. And you can always skip the introduction if you do find them rather repetitive and self-centered. Daisy Lily XXX. That sounds a bit, maybe it's a little bit salacious. I'm sure you're not, Daisy. And if you are, it's no business of mine. Daisy Lily XXX. Thank you, Phil. I enjoyed very much the interview with Clement, and I've ordered his book Strange Antics on audio, and I'm looking forward to your next podcast about Ruth Ellis. Well, that is this one. Yeah, eventually I get round to introducing the show. It is Ruth Ellis is the subject of the bulk of this show. Although I do have a few things to say beforehand, so as ever, you can skip ahead to the interview. And actually, it's a really good interview. Carol Ann Lee, the author of the book on which the brand new drama about Ruth Ellis is based. Cracking interview. I think you're going to really enjoy it. I did it with her only a couple of days ago. Really interesting. But I want to say things. A lot of you commented actually on my last week and the week before about what's happening with Trump, the things I said about Trump and Starmer going there. And of course, since then, Zelensky went there. There was that meltdown in the White House. I don't know what to think. I think many contradictory things. I think that the idea has taken hold in some parts of America, and I think that's mostly MAGA America, that Zelensky is the villain of this story, and he really, really isn't. The moment when he stood up at the beginning of this whole invasion, if you remember, he got out in front of the cameras when there were Russian troops in the city looking to kill him and his family. And everybody thought it'd be over in days. And he stood there and he said, "We're not leaving, we're staying. We don't need a ride, we need ammunition." That was inspiring. The guy is a hero. His people are heroic. They've suffered this appalling invasion from an army of rapists and murderers and crooks and kleptomaniacs from the world's worst regime. And they deserve our support. So I found it very distressing to see him treated like that in the Oval Office. Yes, the war has to end. And I'm quite prepared to accept that maybe needs someone like Trump kind of sitting down with someone like Putin and making a deal. And Zelensky has to accept that. It's still better than being conquered. They did win this war. Effectively, they stopped Russia rolling them over with a lot of help from the West, especially from America. So yeah, I accept the war has to end, but like this, and I think actually what's happening, if you read what a lot of people say on social media, but also some of the newspaper articles that are positive about what Trump is doing, I think they're stuck on Joe Biden. They see Biden as linked to Ukraine. And this goes all the way back to the impeachment of Trump and to all the controversies and scandals about Hunter Biden and his laptop and allegations of corruption. And yeah, they think Ukraine equals Biden. We don't like Biden, therefore we don't like Ukraine. I think it's that simple. But it's also kind of poisonous, and it seems to be threatening NATO, which is, by any standards, the world's most successful defensive alliance of democracies there's ever been. And it seems mad to me to break from a tradition right across American politics, including some of the great Republican presidents. You think of Reagan, what he said at the Berlin Wall, at Pont de Hoc, in the 40th anniversary of D-Day, talking about America's commitment to Europe, to the principles that came from Europe that informed American democracy. Inspiring stuff, and that is a part of the Republican tradition that seems to have been completely abandoned. There's only Liz Cheney and a few others left, it seems, who are arguing for this sort of thing. And then, you think of sacrifice. Vance gets up and he says, people from countries, random countries that haven't fought a war. Do you know how offensive that is on my side of the Atlantic? People were sharing photographs of all the coffins that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of Europeans fought in those wars. America, actually asked for support after 9/11, and it got a lot of it. And it led to a lot of pain. And it shouldn't be so casually dismissed. And it feels to me like it's also, Trump just has this vision of the world. It's almost like a 19th century world of great figures, big power blocks, him, Putin, the Chinese. They'll carve it up. Everybody else has to accept their place. And again, as I say, I do accept this war in Ukraine has to end. Biden kept it on life support. They gave the Ukrainians enough to stop them losing and never enough for them to win. And perhaps they can't win. But they fought the Russians to a stalemate, and they deserve a decent peace. And I think we all deserve to feel that somewhere in the White House, there are people that understand that we are American allies on this side of the Atlantic. Yes, we did. Trump's right, and you've said this before, that we haven't been paying enough for our defense. That's going to change. He's given us a massive kick. Maybe we needed it. But does it have to be like this? I really don't think it does. But I do try to be fair. I watched the State of the Union. It was obvious from that kind of why he won. The Democrats, disgraceful, I thought. What is going on? How can you not stand up and clap for someone who's had a brain injury because someone foolishly let a male-bodied person play sport against them? How can you get up and clap for someone who'd lost a child to the policies, the consequences, you might argue, of Biden's border policies? There were so many things. They just looked mean and angry and confused, the Democrats. So, we've got Trump. We have to make the best of him. But it was a painful week, certainly a painful week for anybody who really feels that the North American alliance, Atlantic alliance and NATO mean something. I'm writing books about the Second World War. It means something to me. And it's not just historical. It means something today as a force for good in our world. And I worry that in a rush to embrace this kind of vision of carving up the plum pudding, some of you might know what I'm talking about, a famous cartoon from the 19th century. Trump wants to carve the world up with other powerful men. Well, that's kind of leave a lot of good people I'm feeling very, very scared. So that's my thoughts about Trump. What to do with Meghan? Oh my goodness, the Meghan story. I did feel sorry for her. I know I'm a bit more sympathetic to Harry and Meghan than many of you, but this was a low point. It was kind of desperate. Yeah, I felt that she was. It's kind of like a cry for help. And it shows that here's this woman who's intelligent and ambitious, kind of reduced to making herself into a sort of American trad wife, if that's the phrase we use these days. And everything about it felt fake. The bloke who came for the first episode was meant to be her best friend. It looked like they'd hardly met. And everything was forced and it just had insincerity written all over it. And I can't help but think what the alternative was here. What was the alternative for Meghan and Harry? If they could have just grinned and grin and bear it, as we say in Britain. Yes, they had difficult relationships with their siblings, step siblings, but did it really have to come to this kind of meltdown, where now instead of doing something kind of useful in the world, using their celebrity, and they do have celebrity power. We've seen it on the tours they do. But instead of going to, I don't know, Australia during a cyclone, popping up carrying a waterlogged koala in a box, which would have been, quite a good use for their fame and celebrity, I would argue, in the family into which she married and seemed keen to marry. Instead of that, she's doing funny things with fruit and talking about sprinkling basil leaves. We call it basil here. Basil leaves over goodness knows what. It was all cringe fest. And you sort of wonder where next for them. I mean, this is like they're wringing the last drops out of their celebrity, which of course all came from the big row. And they were lionized in some quarters for standing up against, speaking truth to power, etc., etc. Have an award. Here's a Kennedy to give you an award. But that's all wearing very thin now. And even people, I think, that would have supported them. Magazines, Variety gave that show a damning review. And that means something in Hollywood. That means a lot. They're running out of allies. They're running out of ideas. And I do think sooner or later, for their sake, some kind of reconciliation with the royals has to happen. Oh, I worry about them. I do worry about them. There's something desperate about that show that I find quite disturbing. Several of you have asked about Jennifer. I talked a lot about her over Christmas and in the new year. My mother-in-law lives around the corner, had a fall on our holiday. Very painful few weeks, but she's been so brave and so strong. She's had amazing help. And when the NHS at its best, and we in Britain, we sort of love our NHS, but we also complain about it a lot. The people have been incredible. People have come with equipment. They sent a carpenter around to install new banisters. She's now walking around her house more or less as she used to. She still uses a wheelchair sometimes, but she's got a walker. She went to the post office for the first time since her fall by her. Well, actually, Frances went with her, my wife. But, she's pottering around. She goes to church with her friends. Her life is returning to normal. But I'm very grateful. And so is she. There many people on here have asked about her welfare. In fact, we're so relaxed about her now. We're going away on another holiday. Next time you see me, I'll be speaking from the Dolomites in Italy, where we're going for a walking and maybe skiing holiday. And Jennifer's going to have a carer coming in for an hour or so a day, but I'm not even sure she needs one. So various of our kids will also be popping in, and her neighbours are amazing. Anyway, that's my life update. That's my feelings about Trump. That's my feelings about Meghan and Harry. Actually, I did an interview on another podcast run by Theo, our producer, called My British Life or The British Life. That should be going out any day, where I talk a lot more about my career and also my feelings about the royals and the biography I did on Diana, how that sort of fed into my feelings about Harry and Murdoch, etc., etc. You may have heard it all before, but it was a fun conversation. And also got to talk about my role in Live Aid, which I've never mentioned on here, actually, have I? And my brush with celebrities in the 1980s. There was a time when I was Bono's best friend. Okay, I wasn't Bono's best friend ever, but I hung out with you two and with Geldof and with those people at that time, and that was fun. So if you're interested in that, My British Life. Okay, Ruth Ellis, one of the great British crime stories that crossed over into kind of judicial and social policy. A woman who was executed, the last woman in British history to be executed. And as you'll find out from the interview, even though there was quite a big campaign at the time, we're talking the mid-1950s, to save her because there were many, many exonerating circumstances that I think today she wouldn't probably be convicted of murder. I mean, she definitely killed the guy, but there were, as you'll learn, there were so many reasons why a modern jury and a judge would probably give her 10 years for manslaughter or murder with some kind of extenuating circumstance. I'm not sure what the legal term is for that. But she herself, I think she thought that death was part of her plan. She didn't take part in the campaign to save her. She didn't encourage it. She was still strangely in love with the guy and had this idea that they would somehow be joined together in death. Anyway, don't talk about death too much on your podcast, Phil. It doesn't work well. But it's a really gripping story. And it has that glamorous, seedy vision of the sort of underworld nightlife of London at that era when people are just coming out of wartime rationing and wanting to have fun, naughty fun. And there's gangsters and there's dodgy politicians. Anyway, mustn't give too much away. I'm going to stop talking. Promise you will never see that wig again. Actually, I got it at the bottom of the children's old dressing up drawer. Goodness knows what's been living in it all these years. Perhaps if I start scratching next week, you'll know why. Okay, thank you for your patience and indulgence. And I'm sorry to all our French listeners who don't like the long introductions, but you can always skip. Right, let's go and talk to Carol, and I'll see you after that. Okay, bye. Well, welcome, Carol, or should I say Carol Ann? I'm not sure. Carol Ann?
Carol is absolutely fine, yeah. Everyone used to think I was American when I first got published, so.
Well, you're very welcome to me, to the Mongers podcast, and to my Australian bar. And yeah, you must be quite excited. We're speaking, what, about 10 days before the series airs that's based on your book. Have you seen it?
I have seen it, yeah. I saw it a few months ago. And it is a very strange sensation because I don't know, when you write a book, I don't know, I can't speak for other writers, but for me, most of my time is either spent in archives or meeting people one to one, and then basically just sat in the corner of a room for several months writing the piece. So even when it goes out into the world, it's a strange sensation. But then to actually see it brought to life, and of course, although it's based on my book, it is a very well-known case. And watching it was just, oh, it was so strange. It really was. I think the first time I watched it, I have to admit, I was so overwhelmed that I didn't take it in properly. But they had the press launch a couple of weeks ago, and I got to see the first episode on a big screen. And I was actually quite shocked by how emotional I was at the end of it. It did make me cry, that
Well,
first
it's a really
episode.
emotional story. I've only seen the trailer myself.
Yeah,
I mean, Lucy Boynton, is a very high-end actress too, who's playing Ruth
yeah,
Ellis. She looks and sounds fantastic, and it reminded me of a phrase my mother used to use. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about class in the
yeah.
interview we're going to have. But my mother, and I think a lot of people's mothers, used to say, "I've got a telephone voice," and it
Yes.
sounded to me that Lucy was giving Ruth that sort of forced posh, because she was a working class girl, wasn't she?
Very much so. Yeah, yeah, very much so. But I think that was really Ruth all over, really. She worked so hard to improve her situation in life, and she really succeeded. But Lucy just completely nailed every aspect of Ruth from start to finish, and she really did. And yes, I would agree, a telephone voice. I think they used to call it, was it the BBC voice, wasn't it? Where it was quite very, very posh. And of course, Ruth didn't really talk like that at all, but she wanted to maintain this image. And there is a scene in the drama where David says to her, "What's your real voice like?" And you can tell she's a little bit insulted because she kind of thought he'd taken that on board, that was her real voice, not her a pretend voice by any means. But yeah, I mean, it's very much about the class system as well. The whole
All right.
case was.
Well, let's start at the beginning because I'm sure a lot of people, especially outside Britain, won't know much about who Ruth Ellis is
Mhm.
and why she was so important. Can you sketch out her sort of childhood and teenage years and where she came from, what she was like as a young person?
Yeah, so she was born in Will between the wars, and she was came from a very, very poverty-stricken background. Her mother was a Belgian refugee during the First World War. She'd come over. Her father worked in orchestras, and he worked on cruise ships, and he did make quite a good living until the advent of the talkies because he'd moved from the cruise ships to working in cinemas in the orchestras and was still doing okay. But then talkies came in, and that was really the end of his career for him. And it was a really, really troubled upbringing, to say the least. They moved continuously, not least because Ruth's father was known to be a very aggressive, violent man. Ruth's sister, her older sister Muriel, talks in a lot of depth about how her father abused her to the extent where she actually had a baby to him.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so to say it was a troubled upbringing is really, to put it as mildly as possible. Having said that, Ruth seemed to, well, yeah.
Is there
So
any suggestion that she was abused by the father as well?
we don't know. We don't know. I mean, it seemed the feeling that you get from Muriel is that she kind of protected Ruth from it as much as possible, but it sounds like though, and it seems very unlikely that he would only abuse one daughter, you know.
Yeah, it does. So there's a phrase that pops up from time to time. She's attracted to obviously a better life, a fast life.
Yeah. Yeah, very
Uh,
much so. She really wanted to escape her background. Poverty was something she absolutely loathed with a passion. That was her big fear. I mean, of course, everybody, that's a silly thing to say, but it was her big fear that she would end up in poverty again. So she basically worked her way up. She worked in restaurants and she worked in bars and so on. She worked in factories. During the war, she also fell in love with a French Canadian airman, and she got pregnant to him. And as a teenager, she had a baby to him. And he turned out to be married with kids back home. So she was left as a single mother at a really young age. But even then, she worked as hard as she possibly could. And by her mid-20s, she was very proud of being able to boast that she was the youngest club manager in London. She'd got one failed marriage behind her then as well. She was married to a violent alcoholic dentist called George Ellis.
yeah.
So, she kind of escaped everything by her mid-20s, and she was sort of looking out on a pretty bright future. She had a flat above the club that she managed, and she still had her son with her. Her daughter, she slightly later gave up for adoption reluctantly. She felt it was the best thing to do because her son was away at boarding school, but her daughter was still only a toddler. So she knew who the little girl Georgina was going to. But she'd really sort of, she was a remarkable woman in many ways. This was
So she's making enough money to send a child to a boarding school, in the
well,
19...
that was with the assistance of Desmond Cusson, who was what people refer to as our other lover, and he was fairly well off, and he
Okay.
helped out financially in that regard. But yes, she was doing really well, and she really genuinely was for herself, having worked through some really tough times, to say the least, as a teenager and a woman in her early 20s, at a time when things were tough for women generally, really difficult.
You mentioned that her husband was violent and
Yeah.
abusive and alcoholic. And given what you've already said about her father, I mean, is she one of these people that seems to, even though she wants to escape from this kind of man, she seems somehow to be drawn to them? Or
I don't think she was, no, I wouldn't say she was drawn to those kind of men. I think, unfortunately, there were a lot of men like that around who were not held to account as we'd like to think they're held to account now.
interesting?
Yeah, so I would say it's more a case of that than anything. And I do think she also, perhaps thought things would improve for her, certainly in her marriage, but pretty early on she realized that things were not going to get better. And he was an alcoholic too, and he was in one of the first kind of drying out clinics in London. But he went back to it. He
Hmm.
never really kicked that habit at all. So that she left him. Um, so yeah, so she was when she'd got to this point where life was stable for her and financially stable too. And then in came David Blakely.
Yes. Well, she's running this, excuse me, this nightclub in Knightsbridge, and it
Yeah.
sounds quite, you know, maybe it's a little bit dodgy. I don't know, but also its celebrities are coming. You
Yes.
know, that there's a sort of fast set that go to her club. She knows people who are in show business. And then, as you say, she meets David Blakely, who comes from a very, very different background to her, which I think is really significant, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes, there was definitely a seedy side to that world. There's no doubt about it, and she had done things that she herself was not ashamed of. But David made her feel ashamed of them, I think, because, as you say, he came from a wildly different background. His father was a doctor. David was born in Sheffield. He was 3 years younger than Ruth. And his father was actually tried for murder, but the whole thing was quashed by the judge at Dr. Blakely's trial. He was a friend of Dr. Blakely, and the whole thing was just quashed,
Bloody hell.
thrown out of court. He'd
That
had an
sounds like
affair.
a story from the 18th century, not the.
It does,
I
doesn't it? But
mean,
Dr. Blakely had basically had an affair with a young working class girl who'd fallen pregnant to him, and he procured some drugs for her that subsequently killed her. She died in agony. But he wasn't held to account. But unsurprisingly, it had a huge effect on the family. So David's mother and father divorced when he was very young. And as you can imagine, it was a hugely acrimonious divorce. He also told Ruth that he'd witnessed his father being violent towards his own mother. Um, but what happened then was that David's mother then married an extremely wealthy man, Humphrey Cook. And then David's life really took a significant turn, really, because he was mixing in far more rarefied circles than as a doctor's son. And he was also what you might call part of the fast set, literally, because he was a racing car driver, which he was really proud of. And he really lived up to that image at that time as well, the kind of hard partying and hard drinking. And he was sleeping around and so on. And he was a good-looking young guy, and he obviously had a real charm about him. But I think Ruth was also drawn to him because she recognized that he had this vulnerability because of
hmm.
what happened in his background. And he did talk to her about that. And I think you can imagine that the two of them, although they seem to come from such very different, environments at that time, especially, I think there was a connection, quite apart from the obvious sexual attraction. I think there was also an emotional connection there that was through their own troubled childhoods.
That's so interesting. They are
Yeah.
quite happy. They are quite happy for a while together, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, they were. I mean, from the very start, there was always huge amounts of alcohol involved on both sides. And as Ruth would put it, David was pretty handy with his fists. So again, she was unfortunately back in a relationship that she all too soon recognized as one that was replicating everything that had gone before for her. But having said that, the difference here, I think, was that she did see that vulnerability in David, where she didn't in the other men that she'd been involved with. And of course, she really lost her heart to David in a way that I don't think she ever expected to do.
Well, no, as
So,
you say, she actually walked out on the first husband and just said
yeah,
goodbye to him, cut him out of the life.
yeah.
Whereas with David, it was so much more intense, and she very much wasn't going to let him get away with it.
No, no. And I mean, abusive relationships, you lose yourself completely in those. You really do. I'm sure many people have had relationships where you look back and you think, my God, I didn't realize how bad that was and who I turned into until I came out of that. And unfortunately, of course, Ruth never came out of that relationship, neither did David. So they were just caught in this spiral
Mm.
of, huge sexual attraction and a real emotional connection, but also, and they did have, there's no getting away from it. They had some really wonderful times together, but underlying that constantly was this threat of violence. David was very jealous. Ruth could be very jealous too, but a man who becomes very jealous, who's 6 foot odd, And, he was sinewy, and becomes very aggressive physically, is no match for a woman who is sort of, 7 stone and 5 foot. It just doesn't work like that.
Doesn't she loses a child after one of their fights, doesn't she?
She did, yeah, she did lose a child. She lost a child towards the very end. And that was David's fault. He'd punched her, and he knew she was pregnant. It wasn't that he didn't know, which was no excuse anyway, but he knew she was pregnant with his child, and he still attacked her, knowing how that could end.
So, as people probably know, this all ends with her shooting him. But
Mm.
these things tend not to be instant decisions. Does she talk to people about a plan? Does she practice? How does she get hold of a gun? What's the process leading up to this famous murder?
Well, we know now that she had this other suitor, other kind of would-be lover, Desmond Cusson, who was also from a wealthy background. His parents ran a very successful tobacconist, and they came from money generally as well. And he really fell for Ruth too. And it all happened at the same time, really. Desmond had met Ruth just slightly before David, and he knew David too. They were on that kind of same social circuit. And Desmond always regarded David as his biggest threat as far as Ruth's affections were concerned, and rightly so. David, for his part, thought Desmond was a fool and a real kind of a joke figure. He used to really take the mickey out of him. In fact, he sends Ruth a postcard from Paris, I think it is, and he puts P.S. love to Desmond on the bottom. So, you can see that he's kind of jeering at him all the time. But when things became particularly bad with David, Ruth would then return to Desmond. And he would, sit and listen to her. She had a tape recorder, and she tapes one of their conversations. And you can tell the two of them, especially Ruth, sounds very, very drunk. And they're talking about David.
You've heard this tape?
Yes, yeah. And she talks about David, and you can hear that very affected accent. She's, he gave me a black eye kind of thing, and she talks about the violence. She does actually say that he gave her a black eye. And Desmond is kind of just, saying, you've had too much to drink, Ruth, you're overwrought, just kind of calm down. But we know that after that, Desmond had his old service revolver in the house. And Ruth's son, who was by then 10 years old, had seen this. He actually told Ruth's French teacher, because she was also having French lessons. She thought that would make her more acceptable to David's social set if she could speak French. But she never turned up for the lessons, so that didn't really help. But yeah, this French...
We've all been there.
Yes. So this French teacher turned up one day, and Ruth wasn't there, but Andre was, Ruth's son. He was there on his own, alone in Desmond's flat, where Ruth was then staying. And she said she was having trouble with pigeons. And he said to her, "Oh, what you need is a gun." And he opened a drawer, and there was Desmond's service revolver. And this woman, of course, later recalled this. But it was Desmond's revolver that Ruth used on David. And Desmond, that is, had taught her how to fire it. He'd oiled it for her, loaded it. He took her out to a forest with Andre sitting in the car. Andre watched it all.
Wow.
And watched him teach Ruth how to fire the gun accurately.
It sounds like the pigeon story was something they made up to protect him. I mean, he must have known what she was planning to do. Do you think?
I do. Yeah, I do. I mean, a lot of people have kind of excused Desmond. But I mean, there's a 1977 documentary that I would recommend to anybody. I think it's just called Ruth Ellis. It's not, you can get hold of it. There have been clips in other documentaries, and we see Desmond in there. The documentary makers tracked him down and interviewed him about his relationship with Ruth. And it's the most excruciating watch, because you can tell he's thinking, why the hell did I agree to be interviewed? And he's so slippery. You can tell he's like, oh, I just don't want to answer this question. But, he was from that background where, if you put a question to him, he kind of tried to answer it one way or another. But I think, a lot of people have made excuses for him and said, well, he didn't know necessarily that she was going to do that, but he very much knew. Not only did he give her the gun, prep it for her, teach her how to shoot, he also drove her to the site of the shooting that night, and then left her
So if
with.
this is, I mean, we'll talk about whether it's a murder or not, but if it is a murder, and that's what it was called at the time, he is accessory to murder, and that's 10
Absolutely.
years in prison at least. So he was
Yeah,
very lucky.
he was very, very lucky, but he was also very, very well connected. So he basically ended up being a prosecution witness at Ruth's trial, which is just unbelievable. And, I mean, I wrote that book it was published, I think, in 2012. But even now, when I talk about that, it absolutely beggars belief that he ended up as a prosecution witness, when he should have been
Yes,
standing there in the dock himself. I firmly
absolutely. I
believe
did
that.
not know that at all. That the level
Yeah,
of that's so interesting. So
yeah,
the shooting itself, I mean, she makes no effort to to sort of cover her traces. She chooses a very public space.
yeah.
It's almost like she wanted to be seen and wanted to be caught. Is that fair?
Um, I think I don't think it's inaccurate. I think yes, it was a very public place. I mean, she didn't necessarily choose that. David happened to be at the pub where she expected him to be. She'd gone to his friend's house where she thought he was first. Desmond had driven her there. Then he obviously dropped her at the pub when they found out he was actually literally down the road at the Magdala with his friend. They'd gone to get some more bottles of beer for the party that was being held. Um, I think what you have to bear in mind is that Ruth's state of mind at that point was, she actually opens her police statement opens with, I am guilty, I am rather confused. And Ruth was nothing if not incredibly truthful. I mean, she really took the detective's breath away with stuff that she came out with that night. It made their job an absolute walk in the park. So when she said she was rather confused, I think we can take it that she was rather confused. And what had led up to that, of course, was the fact that she'd lost everything because of this abiding kind of obsession with David. She'd lost her work as a manager at the club. She'd therefore lost her home. She'd lost her income. She had nothing. She was living in what is now a very well-to-do street, Egerton Gardens. But at the time, in the 1950s, it was run down. It was all scruffy bedsits. And she was living there with her son and David. And a couple of nights before the murder, or the night before the murder, she recalled later when she was in Holloway Prison, she recalled sitting on her bed and just feeling absolutely terrified that she was poverty stricken again. The one thing more than anything that she was frightened of was poverty. Not only that, but she didn't kill David. This is a huge misconception that she killed David out of jealousy. She didn't. She would have shot him many, many months earlier if it was that. She shot him because she could not see a way out in her sort of febrile state. And bearing in mind, she'd had a terrible, I mean, there's no easy miscarriage, but this was a particularly violent one caused by the man she loved, bringing the miscarriage on by in effect, killing his unborn child. She was in a terrible state. And
So why had she lost her job because of him?
because her boss just was furious at the way that Ruth was always prioritizing David. He
Right.
was drinking for free at the club, sorry. He was always there, really hammered. She was supposed to give equal amounts of attention, of course, to everyone who came into the club, but she wasn't doing her job properly. She was always with David. They were always drunk together. And too late, she didn't have the chance to kind of rectify that if she could have done at that stage. I'm not sure she could have done, to be honest.
Okay. So
Um,
interesting that you say that, yeah, she's often portrayed as a woman scorned
mm,
and a jealous woman. But actually, as you say, there's so much more going on in her mind that reaches back to her own childhood and all the
yeah,
terrible experiences
absolutely.
she'd had.
Very much so. And I think you
Hmm.
really have to bear that awful miscarriage in mind as well, and the fact that she's now in the situation. It's, if you imagine what's your greatest, deepest fear, and you're plunged into that, you know, and you can't see a way out. And the reason she couldn't see a way out too was because she knew that David would come back to her. And she actually tells the psychiatrist in prison that this is why she had to end it, because she knew he would come back. She knew he would beat her again. She just didn't see any end to it. And that's why she killed him. And she did it knowing full well that the law was almost certainly going to hang her too. And she just wanted out. She wanted out of that situation, and she could not see another way.
Wow. I mean, the story of her trial and then the death sentence, and a lot of people try to launch a campaign to have her reprieved, and she doesn't really seem particularly interested in getting involved in that, does she?
No, because in her mind, she'd lost the man she loved. She'd committed a capital crime. She'd done it knowing, and she would tell people, I know what the law is, I know how people are going to look at me. I know how the law will look at me. And at the end of the day, I killed him, and she writes this incredibly emotive letter to David's mother days before her death, apologizing for killing him. But she said, I hope you will at least kind of take comfort from the fact that I will die too, and I will
Oof.
die loving your son. Those are her
Wow.
actual words. And the reason why I think she didn't get involved definitely the reason why she didn't get involved in bringing forward Desmond's part in this was because he'd promised her he would look after Andre.
Ah.
He promised he would look after him financially as well as emotionally and provide for him. But she then found out literally a day or so before she was executed that Desmond had completely gone back on his promise. He'd walked out of Andre's life completely. And her solicitor had kept trying so hard to convince her to tell him, how did you get the gun? He found out, but she still wasn't willing to go on record as saying what had happened until the night, a few hours really before her execution. And by then, unfortunately, although people scrabbled about trying to get hold of Desmond, it was too late. It was too late. And there's a note in her file at which I found really chilling. That there are huge files in the National Archives, all the original papers, and across the Home Office file, there's this note after, all these letters have come in saying we want her to be reprieved and so on. And the Home Secretary has just written, the law must take its course. And that's how he saw it.
But it is a considerable public issue, and I think after this, there's no other woman given that death sentence
No,
in
no,
Britain. So
no
she's
other
the
woman.
final. It's the final time it happens, and that's partly because people think the idea of killing a woman offends some people, but also even in the 50s, people thought, well, is it really murder? Is it
Yeah,
really a classic
absolutely.
murder, or is she? Are there extenuating circumstances? Certainly, if the trial was held today, I imagine she might get manslaughter. What do you think?
I think so. Well, yeah, I do, because I mean, it was Ruth's trial that led directly to the plea of diminished responsibility coming in. I'm not sure, but I think it was 1957, but it was certainly very soon afterwards. Um, and her defense lawyers were asked if they could find some sort of precedent that they could, that was their idea. Can we find a precedent? Can we put something forward in court? But
Mm.
unfortunately, Ruth herself too would not kind of play ball in court, because she was still fixated in this mindset still that she had been in when she killed David. So, when she was asked very, very blithely in court, or was it a particularly violent kind of relationship? She said, well, yes, but, he only hit me with his fist and I bruised very easily.
Did she
And
say that?
yeah, that
Oh
was
my
it.
goodness.
Yeah, that was the sum total of the
So
violence.
the jury never knew about the miscarriage,
No,
or
no,
the.
no. The way it was all presented, and you have to bear in mind, back then, of course, trials were shorter generally, but hers was phenomenally short. It was a 2-day trial, and it took the jury, I think it was 14 minutes to find her guilty. But they had nowhere to go, really, in their defense, because the prosecution, the man leading the prosecution was a man called Christmas Humphreys. And he had one question for Ruth. And he stood up and he asked her basically, when you took that gun and you shot David Blakely, Mrs. Ellis, what did you intend to do? And she said, it's obvious that when I shot him, I intended to kill him. No further questions. That
That
was it.
was wow.
She'd signed her own death warrant with those words. But it is incredibly distressing, not only just to look at Ruth's trial too, but to look at what was happening generally then. There was another woman whose name escapes me now. I know she was called Sarah something, and she lived in Manchester. And shortly, this was all happening at the same time as Ruth's trial. And she'd waged this awful campaign against her elderly neighbour and just really brought this woman, oh God, to her knees. It was awful. And she'd killed her by pouring boiling water over her. And this woman died a couple of days later in absolute agony in hospital. And the death penalty was mooted for this woman, but she got off. And I think there are two reasons for that, really, and possibly more. But certainly she was married. She was viewed as a respectable woman.
Mm.
Her husband spoke up on her behalf. And there was no one else involved. Whereas the unfortunate thing with Ruth's trial, or with the murder of David Blakely, rather, was that when Ruth shot him, she had intended to kill herself that night too.
Oh,
And bystanders saw her lift the gun to her temple to shoot herself. And then she just lost her nerve and she just fired randomly. And the bullet hit a wall and then it ricocheted out and went through the thumb of an elderly woman standing watching. And yes, her thumb was obviously destroyed, but she herself thankfully was okay. She wasn't killed. But the Home Secretary again was very clear that one of the reasons he felt Ruth Ellis must be executed was because he couldn't have people going around shooting off guns in the street where innocent bystanders may also be harmed. So that was a huge factor too.
gosh. So the fact that that poor woman lost her thumb might have been that took away even the tiniest chance that she would have had to make a case for extreme provocation, or I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
mean,
what the word.
yeah, she didn't lose her thumb. It kind of went through, but yeah, that was a huge part of why the Home Secretary felt that no, Ruth Ellis has to be hanged.
It's very hard for us to understand how she must have felt. I mean, you've spent a lot of time listening to her voice, reading what
Yeah.
she's. Can you put yourself in her place and think, well, yes, I can understand why she'd want to kill him and then kind of join him, like they're still in love and they're going to
Um,
die together or something like that.
I don't know how truthfully I should answer
It's a
this.
bit Romeo and Juliet like, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is. Yeah. I mean, I can certainly understand very much so what led Ruth to thinking there is no way out. And I think any woman who's suffered violence at the hands of her partner, any woman who's had a miscarriage, and particularly any woman who's had a miscarriage caused by the partner making that happen, you lose your mind. Ruth in some ways seemed very, very level-headed, because she was talking calmly. She was, we have this vision of her, I think, unfortunately, as this hysterical woman who's running around the streets, hysterical for David. She wasn't like that. David and Desmond were the ones who were always shouting. Ruth was one of those really scary people that go quiet when they're really angry. So although she was very quiet in her anger, it was very deep-seated, clearly. And
Mm.
she was in a huge amount of distress. She had lost virtually everything. And this comes after months and months of beatings. Other people witnessed. I mean, one of her friends said she honestly thought that David would be the one to kill Ruth. She'd had to pull him off her multiple times in the flat above, outside the club and so on. She'd witnessed him really beating the living daylights out of Ruth. She went to hospital for it. We have those records, so I can understand. Yes,
I doubt if it would even be manslaughter now. Maybe it
Yeah,
would
I
be,
doubt it too.
but she would have probably been convicted of something, but there's
I
no
would
way
like,
she'd be, no way murder.
no, I would like to think that way things are, well, I don't know, you like to think that we've moved on so far. This is back in the 1950s. This is 70 years ago. Um, the thing is, she had, her sister, she was close to her sister. She was close to her brother. She had really good, genuinely good friends. And that's also one of the things that I must say I really love about this drama, is the fact that, we see Ruth not just as David Blakely's lover, we also see her as a friend to other women. She had a really strong circle of female friends, and when she was in the condemned cell, they were visiting her right until the end. Um, and so, you kind of think, today, would she get to that stage? Would people be able to get her out of that situation? And you want to think that might be the case, but certainly, too often we see so many women killed through their violent husbands and partners, and also, of course, some men, but especially women, you know, being brought to those levels. And it is horrendous, and it really is. And you look back on her case, and I think that's why it still is so, people are so drawn to that case, because although it's the 1950s, it's another time, everything that's in there are still things that we can relate to, unfortunately.
Hmm. Did you feel you liked her at the end? I
Yeah,
mean, would you have been a
yeah,
friend
I'm
of hers?
sorry. And I know that sounds, some people will find that very strange, but yes, I genuinely did. Which is not to say that I think she did the right thing with David Blakely. I do not think the murder was justified. I understand why she did it, but I don't think it was justified. He was 25 years old. He also had all his life ahead of him. But having said that, I think Ruth was genuinely a really lovely person. And the fact that she had, so many close friends, have her family loved her to bits. Her kids, were destroyed by what happened to her. And especially Andre, he was 10 when she was put to death. And, it destroyed him. It did
What
in the end.
happened to him?
Well, I think he was 32 when he committed suicide, and he'd got schizophrenia. He'd been diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and he'd suffered tremendously over the years. He was a very clever little boy at school, but always seemed a bit of a loner. Although he had friends, there was just something, a bit different about him. And he lived a very, very lonely life, really, and committed suicide, like I say, when I think he was 32. But in the days before he committed suicide, he kept insisting that he could see his mother, that she was talking to him. And I think that's obviously what led to his suicide too.
You mentioned the daughter, that she didn't have a huge role in her upbringing.
No.
What did she take an interest later in her life?
Yes, she did. In fact, in many ways, as Georgina, she was called the daughter of Ruth Ellis. Georgina's children um, have said, that she kind of desperately wanted to almost replicate her mother's life. The kind of what she saw as the glamorous aspect of it, and the what I think she saw as the kind of dangerous, but as in a kind of a dark glamour. And I think that's what Georgina was trying to replicate in her life. She drank too much as well on occasion. She took up with some terrible, terrible partners. And then when she met somebody who was more stable, that didn't work either, and she went out with some, she made headlines in the 1970s. She was going out with George Best and Richard Harris and people like that. She was on chat shows and so on, talking about Ruth. And she didn't actually find out that Ruth Ellis was her mother till she was about 8 years old herself.
Right.
And she found all these press cuttings that her adoptive parents were going to tell her about at some point, but she found them, and then they obviously had to say, yes, this is who your mother was. So she had a very, very destructive life herself, and she died. I think she was 50 when she died. She was married again, but you can't say that she had a happy life. She spent her her life really trying to replicate her mother's in so many ways.
Well, I mean, you've written the book of such sympathy and energy. It's clear that as you said now, that you can see the world through her eyes a little bit.
Yeah,
And it sounds like from what you've said that the drama has captured that side of it.
yeah.
So, and I'm really delighted for you as a writer, because as writers, we always dream of TV interest, don't we? Good luck with it. I
Thank
really hope it does
you.
fantastically well and you sell loads more books.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you. Well, I just hope, what I really hope that people will take away from this drama, apart from the fact that it's absolutely brilliant in every possible way, is that I hope Ruth will be seen as I hope she will be seen more accurately now. I think, everyone involved with that drama has worked so hard to make sure that we see as accurate a picture of her life as possible. And I also hope, and Lucy Boynton, who plays Ruth, has done an absolutely amazing job of making sure that whenever she's interviewed, she makes clear that, yes, this is the 1950s, but these things are happening now, and people are not getting the help to get out of violent relationships that they need. So I hope it'll open that dialogue up too, and get people talking.
Very much so. And I think we might be meeting again at some point on Zoom,
Oh,
if
right.
not at the
Okay.
bar, to talk about another of your books. I discovered you'd written a book about the Yorkshire Ripper story, which is something I've not
Oh,
covered
yeah.
on the podcast, and I'd love to talk to you about.
Oh, yeah, that would be fantastic. I mean, it's not about him at all. It's very much about the women who were murdered by him and those who survived and what happened to their families and so on. Because I've no interest in him whatsoever. Yeah, none at all. But I am very interested in those women and how their cases were treated by the
Yeah.
police and by the press and so on. And I do
And I think
think,
we both grew up in that area, didn't we?
yeah,
I was a
absolutely.
teenager when it was happening.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I lived in Cornwall, but we were from Wakefield originally, and
Oh,
we used to come up here all the time. And I remember going to see an uncle who lived in Leeds, in a tower block in Leeds. The lift was always broken. I hated it. It left me with a complete fear of lifts. But I always remember so clearly this billboard saying the Yorkshire Ripper strikes again, kind of thing, something that kind of. And it really stuck in my head. And I do remember being sat at my grandma's house and sort of all the aunts and uncles, it's a huge family, all sat there talking about this case, and then that real feeling of fear coming away from them all.
mm.
So I really, really wanted to look at the background to the whole case and at the women.
The women, the victims, yeah.
Yeah,
The
very much
stories were
so.
not told. The BBC did a very good show on it recently, actually. We tried to redress that balance, but
Yeah,
we're rushing ahead. You'll come back, I hope, and we'll talk about
I
that. But
will.
for the moment, thank you so much, Carol. Good luck with the series.
Thank you very much indeed.
Congratulations on the
Pleasure.
cracking work of journalism.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
It was really nice talking to Carol. I really enjoyed that, as you can probably tell. And we'll definitely have her back, because her book on the Yorkshire Ripper is fantastic too. And like Carol, actually, we don't really like using that term. Shouldn't really use that term, for that terrible man. And her work really brings the victims of him to life and gives them agency and gives them respect, which I'm afraid at the time of their deaths they were often not given. So that'll be an interesting conversation. Talking of which, I've been recording more episodes. I'm not quite sure what's going to be next week. I spoke to a great British historian, Sathnam Sanghera, who's written books on empire and change and history, and that's subjects that really interest me that are very kind of connected to my own book. So that's going to come up fairly soon. Also had another conversation with Mark O'Keefe is back as a joint host, and we spoke about gay lives, a series of books about gay lives in London and Britain in the 50s, 60s, actually all the way through until legalization, or as Mark would say, partial legalization of homosexuality in the UK in the mid to late 60s. Very interesting conversation, actually. Funny and warm and moving stuff. Various other interviews I'm meant to be doing soon. Matt Ridley on COVID. I had to reschedule that, but we're going to do it very soon. And I'm chasing lots of other fascinating material. Caroline Harris will return talking about Catherine the Great. Lots of people, old friends and new, to enjoy. No more wigs for a while. And thank you for your time, for your attention. Please keep liking the show. The subscriptions are nudging up again, which is good. I could always do this some more. I know that quite a few thousand people do listen a week on Apple and Spotify. Only takes a few seconds to open YouTube and subscribe. It would help me if you could. Thank you for that and for your company once again. And the next time I see you, if all goes well, I shall be up a mountain in Italy on the Italian-Austrian border, contemplating. Well, the weather looks a bit dodgy, actually. It could be quite rainy/snowy. I mean, you want snow because it's beautiful. You just don't want it to snow all the time when you're there, and you definitely don't want rain. Anyway, I'll give you a full weather update from my hospital. Oh God, is that a Freudian slip? Not from my hospital bed. That was the last holiday with Jennifer. No, I'll give you a full update from my beautiful hotel balcony, with hopefully lovely views of the snow-tipped, majestic Dolomites. Thanks for your company. See you soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.